You're listening to Tapestry, a podcast by a music lover for music lovers. I'm your host, Kelly. Music is a thread that weaves a course throughout our lives. Join me on a journey to unravel that thread and bring you the stories behind what inspires musicians to create. Side note, Tapestry is an uncensored podcast. Don't say I didn't warn you. What's up, everyone, and welcome to episode 54 of Tapestry, where I was joined today by the absolutely fascinating Frank Meyer. He's the founder of, lead vocalist, and guitarist of the LA-based group Streetwalkin Cheetahs, and boy did he have a lot of really interesting information to give me on this. He is legendary. We talked about all sorts of things, including on wearing your influences on your sleeve as a band and the surprising payoff this can have creatively, working for entities as diverse as NBC, G4, Fender, and even Schoolhouse Rock, on how you can't be both Macgyver and a perfectionist, and why failure is mandatory. Here's a little bit of the track We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For off the Cheetahs' latest album, One More Drink. Yeah, I know we were just talking about Ray Roldan. Ray found me and introduced me to your band. And second I heard it, I had a blast. It's not my usual thing, but I've had a really fun time listening to the new album. And, tell me anything you want to about the band. But first, why don't we go into your musical history a little bit?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Los Angeles, so my musical history is sort of steeped in Los Angeles of the sort of late 80s and early 90s was kind of when I was first starting to go to clubs and see bands, as a little underage kid sneaking in or going to all ages shows. And so at that time in Los Angeles, there was sort of like the hair metal scene, like the Sunset Strip scene that kind of birthed, Guns N' Roses and Poison and that whole sort of like hair glam thing. But then there was also a punk rock scene, and then there was a metal scene. And I really just loved kind of fast, hard rock and roll. And I just wasn't really conscious enough of like what cool was. And I didn't really have that many friends that were listening to as much music as me. So it never occurred to me that and this was back when music was very territorial, like the punks didn't hang out with the metal kids because they were heshers
right.
and stoners. Yeah, and everyone was like separated. And I would go to all these shows and hang out with all these kids because I just liked fast music. So whether it was like Fear and Circle Jerks or the sort of LA punk scene, or whether it was like Armored Saint and early Metallica and Megadeth and all this speed metal stuff going on. And I liked a lot of the hair metal stuff too. A lot of that stuff, I just didn't know any better. And it was all just big, awesome, crazy rock and roll if you're 12 years old, because all these guys also weren't that much older than me. You know what I mean? Like they were like 10 years older than me. But when you're like 12 or 13 or 14 and you see a guy in his early 20s doing, what you thought of was like this unreachable thing that only like rock gods did. And then you're like, but that guy was just standing on the street and he's up there doing it and these guys are great,
He goes to high school with my brother or whatever.
Yeah. I was really lucky because I saw Guns N' Roses when they were an unsigned band.
Oh my God.
They were one of the first local unsigned bands I ever saw was Guns N' Roses. In fact, I'll do you one better. Before that even, and I didn't know this at the time, I learned this later, is the very first time I ever went to a club, meaning like that my parents didn't take me to a concert. So I'd gone to a few shows where like my parents would take me to like Jimmy Buffett or something, Gladys Knight and the Pips, But like I was going to go see Steve Vai. He's a guitar player.
Oh, yeah.
All the guitar nerds know Steve Vai.
Yeah, he's like the shred king.
Right. So I went, this time I was friends. My childhood friend was Dweezil Zappa. And so I went to go see Dweezil play with Steve. Now, Dweezil was a little kid like I was. He was maybe 14. I was maybe 13. And he was like, hey, I'm going to go play with Steve because Steve played with Frank Zappa. And so I went down, I talked my friend's mom into taking us, because my parents didn't have any interest, to go see Steve Vai. And the excuse was, oh, my friend's going to play with him. And the band that opened for him was this heavy metal band called Rapid Fire that you've never heard of.
Okay.
And I had never heard of them, but I thought they were great, mainly because they weren't that old. You know, they were like I said, like they were in the early 20s. To me, that didn't seem that. I was like, oh, they're just like a bunch of dudes. And they had this red-haired singer, and he was awesome. And long story short is I found out later that was a young Axl Rose in one of his first LA appearances ever. Before Hollywood Rose, before Guns N' Roses, the first band he joined right off the bus was from Indiana, was Rapid Fire, did about 4 or 5 gigs with them. I happened to see one, and only learned this 20 years later when I was reading some article about Guns N' Roses. I was like, what? I saw Rapid Fire. I remember it.
I can't wait to tell those stories in 20 years when I'm like,
well, you never know.
This band open.
But you never know. It's like, I didn't know they were just some band. Like it took
Holy
20
crap.
years for me to go, wait a second. So it's like, meaning you could be at any club and see some band. You're like, they're not that good. And then all of a sudden, boom, they're huge a couple years later.
My old drum teacher saw Kansas when they came through Pittsburgh, and tickets were like $2.50. I mean, you really never know.
When I was in college, I remember they used to have these like concerts, sort of out in like, there was like sort of a quad area, sort of like a courtyard kind of thing, right? And every like Friday around noon, lunchtime, they'd have bands play. And I'd be walking back from my classes at lunch break. And one day I walked by and there was this band playing, and it was Sublime. I didn't
just
know,
Sublime.
and they weren't huge yet. They were just a band.
Wow.
I'd heard of them. I remember the name. I was like, oh, that's Sublime. And quite frankly, I was just like, they're all right. And like 2 years later, they were the biggest band in the world.
Don't tell that to Sublime fans. They're like,
I know. Well, I live in Long Beach,
else.
so you can't even, you can't fuck with Sublime in Long Beach. I'm like the one guy out here who's like, they're all right.
You got a target on your back.
Always.
So I do want to revisit you being childhood friends with Dweezil Zappa. I did have that in my little dossier about you, and I thought that was obviously awesome. So was he like the reason you picked up guitar, or did you meet him through learning guitar?
It was more, the guitar was the reason why we even really became friends. My brother and I went to school and to summer camp with his sister Moon and his brother Amit. And then a few years later, so I knew them, but just, as like kids from school. Like when you're young, you know what I mean? Like they weren't famous.
You don't know that their dad's Frank Zappa.
Yeah, I think we knew that their dad was a rock star, but we didn't really have any awareness of like who he was or what his music or anything yet. And we just knew that they were cool kids. And then a few years later, I went to a mutual friend took me to the Zappa's house to hang out with Amit, and I met Dweezil for the first time, who was actually my age because Amit was a little younger than me. Him and my brother used to hang around because they were the same age. And so I met Dweezil, who was my age, and I was already a little Eddie Van Halen obsessed kid playing my little guitar heart out and trying to shred unsuccessfully. And I met Dweezil, and he was kind of like, oh yeah, you play guitar? Here. Tell me what show me what you can do. And he kind of handed me the guitar, and I played him my little Chuck Berry, Sex Pistols licks, and then handed it to him, and he, played like Eruption by Van Halen note for note at like age 12 and blew my mind. And he basically kind of took it upon himself to make me a better guitar player. So he had influence over my playing because he was a really great, prodigy. And I was his pal, and he was nice enough to spend some time kind of trying to improve my game. But I think it was just mainly because we were kids with the same interests,
It's funny how like kids who really, really start guitar young, as many guitarists as I've talked to, it seems like so many of them go through a similar thing where they maybe don't pick up guitar from like this authentic, okay, this is the instrument that speaks to me. It's like, I must be good at this. I have to shred. And I've always found that's so fascinating. And then now you're playing the really fast punk, like hard rock stuff. I mean, did you grow up playing guitar that way? Like treating it like a competition almost?
Well, yes, absolutely. I for sure did. And I for sure still do. But at the same time, I'll say that I really never kind of went too far into that direction of Eddie Van Halen and all that kind of shredding and tapping and the whammy bar stuff. Don't get me wrong. When I was a kid, of course, it was the era of everyone was playing like that. So I learned a lot of that stuff. But as I grew into being a songwriter and to where, which was pretty quickly. I mean, I started playing guitar when I was 12, and Eddie Van Halen was my hero. So right away, I was learning how to do all that flashy stuff and hanging out with guys like Dweezil who could do that flashy stuff and show it to me. And so for sure, when I was younger, I was into that stuff. But pretty quickly, like, punk rock spoke to me, and there was a simplicity there that didn't quite align with all of the shreddingness of heavy metal.
For sure,
and as much as I liked the more complicated metal stuff as a fan, the reality was, as a musician, as a songwriter, I really never quite connected with that stuff as a writer. And when I was a writer, or as I became a writer, the guys that really appealed to me were kind of like the simple songwriters. So the Stones, I was really big into. Tom Petty, I was big into. When it came to punk rock, I loved the New York Dolls and Johnny Thunders and Hanoi Rocks and, just AC/DC I always loved. I loved Motorhead. I kind of like simple bands that write simple music that's easy to remember and kind of sticks in your head. Cheap Trick has always been one of my favorite bands because their songs are like Beatles songs, but even more hard rock. But they're really, really rich and poppy and have all this sort of rich texture and melody to it, but they're like these 3-chord, simple, kick-ass kind of punky rock songs. And that's to me sort of the formula I've always, to be perfectly honest, if you listen to demos of my bands when I was playing as a teenager in the era we were talking about first getting into music, and what I'm doing now, my God, I pray that it's much more sophisticated and much more mature, better. But in terms of the genre, it's not that far off. Basically, I started off listening to T-Rex and New York Dolls and, Cheap Trick and Van Halen and the Sex Pistols. And that's kind of the general area I tread in now. I just think I've gotten much better at it and, blah, blah, blah. You'd hope.
Well, yeah. And I think it's kind of wrong for people to think that, simplicity and musical ability are mutually exclusive with one another. Because I know my podcast, I focus a lot on progressive rock and progressive metal. But as I get older, I'm starting to kind of wind backwards and really starting to see more of the value in the simpler stuff, because it just doesn't, I don't know, there's just a certain quintessential isness of it that's it's fun, it's easy to remember, it has a certain energy to it that you almost don't maybe have to craft.
And I love, I'm a huge Frank Zappa fan, for instance, and he's a very complicated, musically complicated and lyrically challenging and sort of thought-provoking, and he covers lots of genres, and those are all the things that I love about him. However, my favorite Zappa ones are the simple ones where it's just a bitchin' guitar riff and him just ripping. You know what I mean? Because he also, he understood the power of Louie Louie. For all of his work with all these classical, orchestras and all of his work that borderlines on jazz and this, that, and this, the guy loved a 3-chord rock song and a rhythm and blues song. And some of his best stuff was just a great riff where he's just wailing. And so, I love all that stuff. I'm a music fan, so I don't even, a lot of stuff I listen to isn't even rock and roll. I listen to a lot of hip hop and stuff. So I like all types of genres. But if I'm going to be in my comfort zone and where I really like to be sort of just as a human being, it's kick-ass rock and roll. That's just what I do. It's what I've listened to since I was a little kid. It just secretly makes me happy inside. That and horror movies. I really love cheesy horror movies and sci-fi movies. And so if I can just listen to, AC/DC and watch Trancers all day, then I'm in. That's all I really want to do.
Well, that would probably explain a lot of the imagery behind the "We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For" video, and we can go more into that because there's so many cool credits and things in that I want to talk about.
I'm a big pop culture enthusiast, so a lot of the artwork we do and a lot of the videos and stuff is sort of tipping our hats to different, we did a song called Escape from New York City that's kind of a nod to Escape from New York, and the cover of a song called Fuck the Future was sort of a recreation of Class of 1984, which is this sort of early cyberpunk horror movie drama thing. And on the new video for We Are the Ones, it's got this very 80s sort of John Hughes kind of vibe to the music, but all these like video games and puppets and stuff in the video. And, we like to kind of embrace our influences. So like on the album, we have a song that we knew was like, okay, this is basically our Dramarama song. So let's get the singer of Dramarama on it. And that way, instead of people saying it's a ripoff, we go, no, it's a tribute.
It's endorsed because he's on it.
Same thing. We got Rick Agnew from the Adolescents on a song that we wrote basically as a tribute to the Adolescents. And then we were just like, well, let's just make sure that we kind of dodge that. Like, what are you guys doing? We'll just go, well, we got the guy from the Adolescents on the track. So clearly it's cool. We're not ripping it off. We wrote it for him.
If you pay homage to your influences and you get your blessing, it is no longer plagiarism.
That's the secret backdoor way. Yeah, it's the secret backdoor way to street credibility.
Well, so you guys have been in the game long enough, and I mean, I will admit, your energy about this is so refreshing, and I'm nodding along because I'm like, I don't listen to a lot of punk. There's a lot of these bands that I am not super familiar with, but I know being in LA and being part of the punk scene, I mean, it's just birthed a bazillion different bands that have influenced.
Well, not just people. LA too. I mean, to be honest, the LA scene, I mean, our sound is probably much closer in general to what you'd think of as the New York or the like the Detroit scene. We were really into the MC5 and the Stooges early on, and the MC5 and the Stooges were doing a lot of like freeform jazz stuff too. Like they were listening to Sun Ra and Pharoah Sanders, and then listening to like John Lee Hooker and Chuck Berry, and then The Who, and doing this sort of weird thing that was like kind of hard rock, sort of punk rock before it was punk rock, sort of metal before it was metal, but then with all this freeform jazz thrown in between these short bursts of 3-minute hard rock songs. So I always loved punk, but the stuff that really, I think, influenced our band more wasn't as much of what you think of as punk. It's almost what people call proto-punk, which is like before they knew what to call it. So the New York Dolls were doing kind of the Stones thing, but dressed in drag with just ripping chainsaw guitars, and all the songs were way dark and more like apocalyptic and more about heroin and fishnets and Max's Kansas City. So it was like, that was punk, but there wasn't. And they didn't call it punk. And the Stooges, stage diving, broken glass, double kick, TVI, I mean, I got it right. I mean, those are like, that is full-blown double kick drum, hardcore punk, Bad Brain style, 15 years before it. No one knew what to call it. They just called it shitty. You know what I mean? And the same thing, so there was a crop of bands that, that were doing this sort of thing that became punk, and that was the stuff that Dino and I and Art from the original sort of version of the Cheetahs were really connecting on, as we were like, we love punk.
And this is in the 80s, right?
Well, I mean, our band started in the mid-90s, and a lot of the music I'm referring to right now is from the 60s. I mean, most of that proto-punk, like the Detroit stuff, was happening in 68, 67, and 69 and into the 70s, and then the Stooges were like late 60s into the 70s. But around 73, you got the New York Dolls, and you got, by then Bowie was around, and Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. So all of a sudden you had this sort of new wave of like taking what the Stooges and the Doors and stuff were doing and bringing a little bit more raunch to it. And then a few more years later with the Sex Pistols and the Damned, that's when it became punk. Okay, no one really called it punk until the Sex Pistols and the Damned.
I definitely needed the history lesson because I thought, you know what, I'm just going to let Frank explain it to me because I figured you guys have been a band for so long. I'm just saying, you had so many influences, like, he's going to know all. He's going to have all the dots connected.
And we know our LA punk, but I don't really think we sound like an LA punk band. Like we've never sounded like a West Coast punk band. If anything, this album probably sounds a little bit more West Coasty because we've got that Adolescence nod, but I feel like we were always much closer to like Cheap Trick meets the MC5 meets the Dead Boys or something.
Well, for all my punk listeners out there, you can let what Frank just said speak for itself because, when I listen to punk, it's like Bad Religion and that's about it. Like I do not have a good breadth on punk or even hardcore. I mean, I'm very well connected with some people here who are in the hardcore scene, but like hardcore is a term that almost doesn't mean anything to me because you have all these little regional crop ups, and it I think can become so confusing and almost antithetical to be like, well, we are an XXXX band. Like, it's kind of like, who cares? You just sound like what you sound like. You know?
And even that, I mean, I don't even know that I'd really even call us a punk band, although certainly that was something early on that we embraced just because it made a little bit more sense in the 90s to be punk than rock and roll, because rock and roll kind of meant at that time, like, you mean like the Black Crowes or Blues Traveler? And we were like, no, definitely not that. So, you know, in relative terms, we're like, yeah, we're fast rock and roll. So I guess that means we're a punk band. But as it's all shaken out, we've been around long enough. Like we really are a rock and roll band. We have punky stuff and that's fast, and we have poppy stuff that's pop, and we have some stuff that sounds kind of heavy metal and whatever. Like I don't think about any of that when I write a song. I just try to write a good song.
Right. Have you guys always had the horn section too? Like from the inception?
We've always had horns. We never really added it full time until the last few years. Back in the day, we had Angelo Moore from Fishbone was a big supporter of the band. So he used to, if we were on tour with them or if he was around, he would jump up and play with us. And then we had a couple other guys from different bands. And so it was just sort of something, we had a few songs that we could add horns to at any time. And they were sort of, like I was saying, sort of free-for-me. So we would just turn to, oh, you play sax? Okay, we're in E. And by the way, you don't need to worry about sticking to E. And then we would just go for 15 minutes on one E chord with this freak-out song we had. And it would sound, the less context they had, the better it sounded. And because then it was really avant-garde, you know? And then eventually we met this guy, Jeff Yaton, and Jeff was a fan of the band, and he really kind of understood sort of how to make the sound work with us on a more, like he started playing on songs that didn't have sax before, and we were like, ooh, we like that part, or yeah, you're doubling the guitar there, it adds more power. So he's a guitar player, singer himself, so he really understands how to make sax work in our sound. And we've always liked it, but now it's, you know, part of our sound.
Yeah, because as I was listening through One More Drink, your new album that you released this year, that really was what stuck out to me. I think the rhythmic fun of most of the songs, but then those little bits of sax and stuff, I'm like, this is just so fun. Like, you cannot be sad listening to your stuff. It's just so high energy and fun.
It adds fun texture too, because you don't often hear sax in big guitar rock. So I kind of like that it just instantly makes it a little different. But a couple band, you know, like I said, there's a band out of Finland from the 80s that were sort of this underground band called Hanoi Rocks, and their singer Michael Monroe played sax, and they always used a lot of sax. And, you know, Alice Cooper on his early records used to use sax. So I've heard it here and there, and I always just thought it was really cool. Anytime I would hear sax in the middle of a hard rock, chainsaw rock song, I was like, ooh, that's cool. So we just tried to work it in, you know. And the Stooges. I mean, the Stooges on one of their most famous albums. You can see what a music nerd I am, but their album Funhouse has sax on every song, and that's like, that album's from 1970, and it's again one of those proto-punk records that's totally doing punk and metal before there was punk or metal. And there's sax on every song on this sludgy guitar gloom and doom record, and it somehow makes perfect sense. When we're done, go look up the album Funhouse by the Stooges. It's like one of the greatest albums ever, and the sax is just insane.
I may have had that recommended to me because saxophone was my very first instrument, and I'll always be partial to it. Yeah, I'll always be partial to it, even though I don't really play it anymore. But you're right. It does really offer a lot of sonic texture that, you know, we all get kind of ear exhausted when we listen to, whether it's 3-chord pop punk or rock or whatever. It's just guitar kind of dominates the Western musical culture. And so it gets tiring sometimes, like when that's the only thing.
And sometimes we'll just use it to like double a guitar line, meaning if it's a song where there's a guitar line being played, you know, like a melody line as opposed to a chord, sometimes we'll just have the sax double that because it just makes that melody pop out even more, and it just gives it a little bit more texture, you know.
So I want to hear a little bit more about the early days of the Streetwalkin Cheetahs. Like, how did you find your band members, and how did you kind of come into your own as a songwriter with the group?
Really being music nerds and movie nerds has kind of been the thing that has always kind of been the through line of this band. I originally met the original guitar player, Art Jackson, and I went to college together, and we had played in kind of like a punk rock cover party band. Like we learned, you know, Ramones and Stooges songs and played a couple parties and stuff. And So that probably planted the seed. Then a few years later, Art and I were living together in the Valley and in Los Angeles, and there was a video store back in the days of like DVD video stores. Right. And I'm a guy who's a super movie nerd, and I would always go in looking for like cheesy horror movies and cult movies and all this stuff. And the guy who worked behind there was this guy Dino, who became our bass player, and he always had like Germs or Plasmatics t-shirts, like cool punk rock t-shirts, and I'd always be like, oh yeah, Wendy O. Williams, Plasmatics, and we'd get into a conversation about her that would lead into the movie Reform School Girls, that would lead into this, blah blah blah.
So fast friends, basically.
Yeah, immediate fast friends, and we just decided to form a cover band, sort of like Art and I had done in college, to just sort of like play obscure songs by our favorite bands and maybe do a few gigs. And that's what it was, but pretty quickly, and that's why we called ourselves the Streetwalkin Cheetahs, because one of the first songs we did was Search and Destroy by the Stooges, and that opening line is, I'm a streetwalking cheetah with a heart full of napalm. So we were like, okay, well, since we're playing a bunch of Stooges songs, plus New York Dolls and blah, 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 we'll be the Streetwalkin Cheetahs. It makes perfect sense. And what happened, and we wrote a few originals along the way that kind of sounded like the songs that we were covering. I was already writing songs, and I had played in blues rock bands and metal bands and hard rock bands and punk bands. So I was already doing my thing, and so was Dino. But in this band, suddenly, in a weird way, by doing the covers thing and it being so hyper-focused on one genre, it made writing songs sort of easy, because it was like, well, we know what they should sound like. One of these 5 bands, you know what I mean?
Huh, okay.
So that, I think by about our 5th show, this guy named Greg Shaw, who was kind of a big deal indie rock guy around Los Angeles, he had started Bomp Records, and Bomp Records was the first indie rock label in LA and one of the first in the United States, as far as I know. He originally put out the song Million Miles Away by the Plimsolls. He originally put out Johnny Are You Queer Now by Josie Cotton. He originally signed Stiv Bators after the Dead Boys and put out the Iggy Pop Kill City record. So in the world of indie rock, he was like kind of a big deal guy, sort of like a Rodney Bingenheimer type. It's a long story, but I'll make it short. I had met him because I was writing liner notes for him for Stooges records. That's what a nerd I am, is I basically talked him into letting me write liner notes because I knew so much about it. And he came to see us one night. I think he was a little drunk because we played almost all cover songs, and he comes up to me and he goes, hey man, this is great. You guys got more songs like that? And I'm like,
those weren't our songs.
I mean, in my head, I'm like, yeah, your label put out half these songs. And he was like, yeah, man, if you can come to me with an album of songs like that, we're good to go. I'll sign you guys right here. And I was like, wow, cool. So I went backstage to the band, and I was like, well, the good news is we just got signed after our 5th gig. And everyone was like, wow, that's amazing. And then I'm like, the bad news is we got to immediately write an album for the songs that sound like the Stooges meets the Dead Boys meets the Runaways, and go. But we did it, and that became our first album. And then quickly, the long story short is for the next 10 years, we did a few more records for Bomp, a bunch more for Triple X, and we kind of just kept grinding and doing EPs and singles and songs on soundtracks and just whatever we could. We got a booking agent. We toured the world. We did Europe a bunch of times. We did the States more times than I could possibly imagine. Touring with a lot of bands we loved, Super Suckers, Fishbone, Reverend Horton Heat, Nashville Pussy, all these bands. And there was sort of a movement of bands like from Europe around that time, the Helicopters and Turbo Negro, and these bands sort of from Sweden were doing it. So suddenly we had all these sort of bands we could hook up with in Europe, and it was kind of a cool thing. And the long story short is, after 10 years of making records and everyone's saying, like, you guys are going to be the next best thing. Like, we'd put out a record, it would be in Rolling Stone, and they'd be like, they're the best punk band in America. They're going to be huge. And then a year later, we'd be like, when's that supposed to happen? Check that magazine again. They said we would be huge by now. Yeah. And so, after a while, it was just like the expenses were building up. The audiences were slowly getting smaller. And we just weren't making any money. And as we were careening into our 30s now, and we weren't quite kids anymore, and it was just like, the fuck are we doing, Yeah. So we broke up and kind of just decided to take some time off. meaning we continued to play together in different bands. And after about 10 years of, raising kids and screwing around in sort of little side project bands, we eventually just got back together, got right back on the horse, started playing, and eventually made this record, One More Drink. The one sort of little side note I'll tell you that what became kind of something we were known for was just that, obviously we wear our influences on our sleeves. You can tell. I'm always talking about the bands that we love. And along the way, we kind of started stalking/volunteering ourselves to any sort of cult hero, punk rock icon that we could, if they needed a backing band or a touring band or a recording band.
Nice.
So we became Wayne Kramer from the MC5's band for a few years. And then we were Sylvain from the New York Dolls band for a few years. And then we were with Cherie Currie from the Runaways on and off for like 10 years. And we did stuff with Dennis Tech from Radio Birdman and Cheetah Chrome from the Dead Boys. And I ended up playing with Bob DeRoe of Schoolhouse Rock. Do you know what Schoolhouse Rock is?
I do. And I saw that. I'm like, holy shit, this guy is like well connected to just everybody. That's insane.
I played guitar and sang and did voices in the touring Schoolhouse Rock review when Rhino Records put all that stuff out on like a box set and DVD and stuff in the 90s. They reunited all of the original members that played on it, which was led by Bob DeRoe, this jazz sort of cult icon. And he and I got along, and he hired me, and I went on tour with them. And I gotta go, lolly, 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 get your adverbs here.
No, I have extremely strong memories of course, you have the bill on the Capitol House steps, Schoolhouse Rock.
There was a couple shows. So that guy who sang that song, and he also sang Unpack Your, he sang I'm Just a Bill, and he sang, I forget, a bunch of others, but he's the bill. Oh, Conjunction Junction. He's the guy that sings Conjunction. Yeah.
Conjunction Junction. Right. What's your function? Yeah.
His name is Jack Sheldon, and he was a famous trumpet player and singer, and he played with like the Merv Griffin Orchestra for years, and he was an actor. He was on like the Love Boat and shit. And then he also was a session, for hire guy for Schoolhouse Rock. And most of the tour that we did, he was not on board. But when we came to LA, he did the LA show and I think two others. And he played piano and sang. And dude, for those shows, him at the piano, Conjunction Junction, and it was doing I'm Just a Bill. It was so crazy.
I've just never given that more than a second of thought, because okay, I'm 30, so I'm at the late 90s kid thing where I am old enough to know Schoolhouse Rock.
They still show those on TV, those are timeless.
I've just never thought about the fact that those were real people, in a studio. Like when you're a kid, you just think, oh, it's just cartoons, but it's they were real people having to perform all that stuff.
They were actually, and they were all kind of handpicked, cream of the crop. In that, the drummer was named Denny Sylwell, and he was in Wings. Paul McCartney and Wings.
Paul McCartney's what?
Mainly because he was a big session drummer at the time, and he could do jazz and he could do rock, and those songs were kind of like little musicals. And the reason why Bob DeRoe got the gig, because he told me this, is that he was sort of a folk guy and he was a jazz guy. He played on Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain album. Damn. And he had some folk records, and he did this album that was sort of a novelty record where he took the ingredients off the back of cans and Xerox paper, and he would sing them and turn them into songs. Oh my God. And he put out an album where it was like advertising jingles, except instead of advertising, it was just the ingredients and instructions. And that was the thing when they needed someone who could help write and sing and sell what might be dry educational, a song about adjectives. They were hand it to this guy. He made the fucking instructions on the back of a vegetable soup can sound entertaining. So that's how I got the gig.
Skills that you never thought would come in handy, but I guess they did. Well, just thinking about how you said you kind of self-inserted your band and stuff, you really do miss 100% of the shots you don't take, but I give you a lot of credit for just asking. I mean, when you're a super fan of a band, nothing feels cooler than either getting recognized by them or being connected to them in some way. So that had to feel awesome.
I think the coolest part about doing stuff like that is actually it's that like usually if I meet someone, for the first time that I'm in admiration of, I'm usually pretty transparent that like, oh my God, I am a huge fan of yours. And usually I'm such a gushing fanboy when I first meet someone, but in a respectful way, of course, that, instead of it coming off kind of like creepy, which believe me, it can be, I think people tend to kind of go like, wow, this guy who's also an artist, because usually I'm throwing it out there or being introduced or something where they're like, oh, this guy's a musician or he's a TV producer, he's a film director or an author, because I've done all those things,
okay.
So they go, oh, well, he's a fellow artist, but wow, he's really inspired by my stuff and he genuinely like knows his shit and like, wow, what, this is someone I might want to chit chat with a little bit. So then at some point I'll usually say something along the lines of, like, hey, I have this idea of something, or do you need a backing band right now, or a guitar player, or a singer, or a producer, whatever the fuck I think might be my way in.
Yeah.
But then at that point, the fun part about it is that then once that business is over the way, at that point you're just dealing with them as a fellow artist, and that's when it gets fun, because then all of a sudden you kind of get to know what they're actually like as an artist and a musician, and at that point you kind of can't be a fanboy anymore, because you're doing something creative with them, or you're doing something that you're getting paid for, or you're on the road or whatever, and at that point it's just all business or fun or whatever, but the fanboy shit goes out the door. And I grew up in Hollywood. Like, I've known famous people my whole life. I don't trip on them being famous. I do trip on if I truly admire someone's work. So, like, it's not about, wow, you're famous. It's more like, dude, I love your music so much. It really means something to me. I met this guy, like, I'm super into movies and horror movies and 80s, like, genre movies. And I love this guy, Charles Band. He ran Full Moon. He runs Full Moon Pictures and he used to run Empire Pictures. He's the guy that directed Puppet Master and Demonic Toys and Evil Bong and
Evil
like
Bong. Did you say?
Bong. Yo, Bong. I sure did. And and my favorite Trancers. And he's been around forever, and he's just done lots of like sci-fi movies and horror movies and stuff. And I'm like a super, super nerdy fan for that stuff. So a movie I directed was up for this award, Best Documentary, Best Music Documentary at the Film Thread Awards. And I just happened to be wearing my Trancers t-shirt, because where else are you going to wear a nerdy movie t-shirt but at a film awards? And I walk in, and the guy from the awards goes, oh, that's funny, you're wearing a Trancers t-shirt. Charles Band's right over there. And I was like, what? Boom! And I ran over there. I was like, Charles Band, my name is Frank Meyer, and Trancers, and Laser Blast, and Demonic Toys, and versus Doll Man, and Puppet Master 1, Puppet Master 2, Puppet Master 3, Puppet Master 4, Trancers 1, Trancers 2. And he was just like, calm down, son. And by the end, I had pitched him. I was like, I do actually have this idea I've always wanted to ask you, and I don't want to say what it is yet in case it doesn't happen, but like I threw out this idea of something I want to do with him, and he was like, that's great. Here's my card. Call me. And I will. I promise you I will be working with Charles Band soon if I have anything to do with it.
I feel so understood by that, because that is exactly how I network. And like, I'm just a nobody, I just do this for fun. I just love having conversations with people like yourself. But even for people who are at like different, I guess you could say, tiers of whether you want to call it stardom or notoriety or skill or whatever, I think that tactic works. Like, if you express an authentic...
If it's genuine. It has to be genuine.
Yeah, if you express a genuine love for a person or something, and actually, I knew I was going to bring this up because you are friends with Dweezil. I have stayed in touch with my ex-boyfriend, but I'll never forget when we started dating, he said, oh, I'll never forget the time I saw Dweezil Zappo when he played in Pittsburgh, and all I could say to him after the show, because, my ex is a guitarist, goes, all I could say to Dweezil was, hey man, keep doing what you're doing, and then walked away, and he's like,
what?
Yeah, I will. Like, what do you think he's going to say? But he's like, that's all I could get out in the moment, because truly, he's just like one of my favorite guitarists, and that's what my stupid brain dump
was. And it's not like every time you meet someone that you have to try to form some sort of bond with them or something. I mean, like, meaning, it's for me, it tends to be a lot of my people that I get passionate about aren't necessarily hugely famous people. They're like cult heroes.
Same.
So a lot of cult heroes are genuinely stoked. if you are, of course, again, in a nice, respectful way. I'm not talking about interrupting someone when they're eating or, and I'm not like a big autograph guy. Or I'm not even a big photo guy. Like, don't get me wrong. I mean, I took one with Charles Band because I was freaking out. But, like, I genuinely, if I see someone that I want to talk to, it's because I have something I want to say to them. It's not just because I want to meet someone famous. Quite frankly, if I see someone, like, that's fine. I've been around enough celebrities to know that a lot of celebrities are kind of dicks, and I would rather not find out that someone's a dick or cushy. So it's like, unless I have a reason to talk, I don't bother. But if it's someone like Charles Band, where I actually had been thinking like, oh man, if I could ever meet Charles Band, I would pitch him this idea. So when I met him, I just told him how much I loved him. I pitched my idea. If it's a musician I really love, even if there's no agenda, if I felt the need to say it and it felt genuine and appropriate, I might say, man, I'm a really big fan of your work or something. But I wouldn't do it unless I felt like it somehow was appropriate or there was sort of an agenda that I had something I want to discuss with them, or I don't know. It's just like, it's not about meeting famous people, but it is, as a musician, about jamming with people you think are awesome.
Right.
What else? I mean, those are the only perks we get as a musician. Like, I don't get paid well for this shit, So if I get a jam with the MC5 guitarist because for my entire life I always wanted to jam with the MC5 guitar player, and the one thing that my tiny bit of notoriety gets me is that, well, fucking, I'll take it.
Why would you not do it? Exactly. Why would I not do it? Exactly.
And all I got to do is ask. Fuck, of course I ask every time.
That's a teachable moment right there.
Right.
Well, I could go one of two ways here. I did want to ask you kind of what your general philosophy is on music creation. Like, what drives you to make music? Why is it, your vocation? Though I know now you're also an author and a TV producer. But on the same token, being that you've, met bunches of famous people and stuff, how did you get hooked up with the guy from Crank Yankers to work on the puppetry for your band's music video? We can answer either or, but
yeah,
I wanted to get it out there before I forgot.
Well, so after the Cheetahs, throughout my music career, I've always been a writer. It was kind of the way that I made my bread and butter as a young college student and stuff. Was I wrote for magazines and fanzines and and whatever I could, and that took me into doing like publicity and showbiz, and I always sort of had some hustle to make rent essentially while I was playing punk rock. Then for several years, when the Cheetahs got signed and we were touring more full time, I was just doing writing kind of on the side because I could write from wherever and send in my stories. Excuse me. And then when the band broke up, I realized that the writing was probably the best thing I had as far as a way to make, a real career that didn't involve touring and playing guitar. I got married and we had a kid, and I just didn't want to be one of these like flaky rock dads living in a van and never seeing his kid. So I still wanted to play music, and I still continued to play music. But at that point, long story short, I got a book deal, and I wrote a Ramones book, and then that led to writing a bunch more books, and then that led to getting a job as a writer at NBC, and then that led to becoming a producer and a director at NBC, and then that led me going over to Fender, where I was a producer and writer for their digital content. Oh, wow. And then along the way, I'd written 8 books, and then I directed a documentary film about a Wu-Tang Clan rapper that suffered a brain aneurysm. It's called Risen, the Story of Shron Hell Raises Smith. And that is the film that was up for the award the other night. And, that's sort of the beginning of my film career. That was catching you up because you had asked something. Well, what was the last part of your question? Because you asked sort of a 2-part question. That was the first part. What was the second part?
It was kind of the philosophy of like what drives you to make music. But really, I mean, your resume is crazy. The thing about
but you had a specific question at the end, though.
See, this is the problem. I asked questions.
The puppet. I did,
puppet.
Yeah. Right. So, no, here's where that was going.
Because you're so well connected, and I figured that just,
So when I was doing, when I was at NBC, this is where it gets us to the puppets, is not something you often hear your punk rock people say. This is where we get into the puppet part.
Yes.
what happened was I was working at the G4 TV network, which was the video game TV network.
I've watched G4 all the time.
So I worked for Attack of the Show and X-Play, and I was a field producer and working for the website for those shows and a bunch of other stuff, American Ninja Warrior, all sorts of stuff. And I had done a few different puppet-related sort of comedy sketches for them. And I also did a TV show for MTV Europe around that time called Video Game Theater. And that was me and my writer friend Scott Chernoff and BJ Geyer, who is the puppet guy from Crank Yankers. We met him through a writer friend of mine, Steven Johnson. And we had written this idea for this show. We did not know how to make puppets or do puppets, but we had this idea. And my friend Steven was like, oh, I actually happen to know a really good puppet producer who has like a whole puppet team in a studio. So we went to him and worked out a deal to bring him and his studio on board as producers to make the pilot. We made the pilot, sold it to MTV Italy of all things, got a deal for like 16 episodes or something like that. Did that there. And that was how I met, my team of puppet makers. So then all these years later, when the Streetwalkin Cheetahs made the We Are the Ones video, I kind of called some favors in from my fellow, puppet and people and animators and illustrators. And plus I had some old footage, some outtakes and stuff from some of the stuff we'd done before. So I kind of hodgepodged the whole thing together and made this insane video.
That makes so much more sense now because I'm watching it and, you have Pac-Man, you have Donkey Kong, you have I think there's some claymation in there, maybe. I don't know if I imagined that.
There's not claymation.
All kinds of stuff.
But what we were doing, we did stuff where we would take toys and sets. We would take toys and make sets. Kind of, in a way, sort of like the Robot Chicken does a little bit, where it's
yes.
We were taking found objects and toys and then filming them against the green screen and then projecting stuff in the back. But the stuff we were projecting were drawn with crayon stuff that I did so that it really looked childlike and sort of sloppy. And then we were doing puppets on top of that, essentially. So it was sort of like a 3-layer thing.
It had something for absolutely everyone in it, because that was the first video I watched.
Pac-Man does heroin,
it's all over the place. No, okay, thank you for following my crazy off-the-rails question there, because I thought, damn it, if I don't ask him about Crank Yankers, I'm going to forget, even though I'm looking at my notes here.
Well, and I guess just getting back to the first part, I guess my philosophy is mainly I'm an artist, man. The way I see it is I make music, I write, I direct, I produce. I have a big tool belt. When left to my own devices, if I'm not worried about getting paid or I'm not worried about, seeking approval from others, because when you work for other people, you need their approval. Mm-hmm. If you need stuff to get paid for that you can't afford yourself, then you need to seek that. And those people might need approval. That changes things, But when left to my own devices, I tend to make rock and roll music and indie movies about struggling artists. I guess I can relate to that. And I tend to write a lot, which usually finds its way into book form. And that's kind of, sort of what I do. But the reality is, I have a kid who's off to college and car payments and everything else. So I'd be lying if I didn't say I do a lot of gigs. And this is where I found my way into directing and producing, because those are much more concrete ways to make a steady paycheck. Being a guitar player and a producer and a songwriter is, it's a hard way to make a living, and you can sometimes get paid really well, and you sometimes get paid shitty, and you sometimes don't get paid at all, but you do it because you want to be involved with something happening. Or you've got your own muse or your own story to tell or your own music to make. And you just say, fuck it, I'm going to make it regardless.
It's the artist's way, I think, really.
Right. But if you're lucky, or this is my philosophy, has been that I made a decision a long time ago that everything I do was somehow going to be connected to art and creativity, some more directly than others. But I've had jobs in the past that were not at all creative or artistic, or where I was just taking a paycheck and doing stuff in show business, you know, that I just had no emotional connection with, no heart, no soul. And I kind of at some point was like, look, I may not always be able to make my money playing guitar, but I'm going to always figure out a way to make my money using my brain and my creativity and my knowledge of show business and pop culture and my experience. And the fact that I can do a lot of stuff, you know, well, I can do a lot of things. You know, but playing guitar, unfortunately, is the one that pays the least. So directing and producing pay much better, you know?
I know. And it's so sad to hear that, because it's like every episode, you know, a lot of times I'll ask people like, what defines success to you? And, you know, why do you do what you do? And it's like, the answer almost never changes. I mean, people don't go make music for a living because they want to get rich. I mean, the very lucky few get to do that. But it sucks that we have music so wrapped up monetarily speaking, when it's almost like it's on two different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, you know? But I think if you're lucky and or you work really hard and kind of sort of try to position yourself, you can sort of find this middle ground, you know, where like you can do the art that you really love at night and on the weekends. And then you do the thing that's maybe not exactly what you like, but as close as you can get without wanting to jump out of a fucking window every day at the end of your 8-hour shift. And that's what you do to make money. And you're not a sellout as an artist for having a day job, because you can't be an artist without paying the rent. I don't care what anyone tells you. If you don't figure out a way to pay the rent, you're not going to be an artist very long. You're going to be a homeless person. So everyone has priorities, and that's what life as an artist is aligning all that shit and figuring out a way to still be an artist when you're 50, 60 years old, still doing what you love, and somehow not being homeless. If you can solve that conundrum, you've made it. That is success. Right. Success is still doing what you love without being homeless. That is success.
Quote, Frank Meyer. Well, that... I say this all the time. I'm like, well, that takes me to my next question. But that was truly the most perfect segue into a question I also like to ask a lot, which is, if you could change anything about kind of the musical ecosystem or the industry, what would you change? And I imagine, you know, being an LA person, you've freaking seen it all at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange thing, because I probably would have said, you know, bands on the road and bands playing clubs are generally underpaid, and it wouldn't be awesome if that could change. On the other hand, COVID sort of erased that conversation, because now no one's played a gig and everyone's so stoked to get back to anything. But the reality is everyone's going to be more underpaid now, because if you had a club that fit 300 people and you can only go 50%, then either you're doubling the ticket price, so you're going to have a harder time, you know, hitting those numbers, and the fans are suffering, or the band gets paid less. I mean, right. They're not going to have less security. It's going to be the band gets paid less. So it's going to be a lot harder to make even the money we were making. So in a way, I'm like, I don't know, man. I'll just be stoked to get back to any kind of gigs. I think the biggest complaint I would just have is that it's really, I mean, you hear people say this all the time, but like, we get paid really poorly on streams. It's a weird kind of catch-22, because if you put your music on the digital platforms that everyone has, Apple Music and iTunes and Amazon, Spotify and Pandora and all that stuff, you get paid such a ridiculous amount that you just, essentially you don't get paid. You really are giving it away. If you're selling, you know, 5 million albums, yeah, sure, you're getting paid at that point, but who the hell is selling 5 million records anymore? You know what I mean? Like, it's just not happening. So the only way to really make money off digital sales is to do it through like Bandcamp, where you actually get, you know, $1 a song, or people can donate. The problem with, which is a great way, and I do it, and I love Bandcamp. You can buy the Streetwalkin Cheetahs record directly from us through Bandcamp, and we've got like fan packs and CDs, you know, they're out of print now, and all sorts of cool stuff. So I'm in full support of Bandcamp. However, you know, a lot of our audience is not 19-year-old kids. They're older people that in their 30s, 40s, and 50s and stuff. And like a lot of them are A, not hip to it technologically. B, they're not hip to, like, they get it and then it sits on their desktop and they're like, oh, what do I do with it now? How do I get it into my iTunes? Like, they don't know what to do with this loose track. And so I find that there's some folks that just will never quite wrap their head around anything that's not one of those big music services. And then, you're losing potential revenue off not having those people buy it through you because they just don't understand it,
Well, yeah. And I think from an outsider's perspective, looking in, I mean, so much of the kind of the punk ethos is, DIY and buying physical media and, being there face to face with people. But obviously COVID has changed all that. There's only so much you can combat right now. Which it seems like that's why you guys kind of turn toward the music videos and stuff. Because you're like, we can't tour, might as well make music videos.
Yeah, I mean, I pivoted a lot like that this year. I mean, for sure, the Cheetahs had barely done music videos before, and we've done, like 3 or 4 in the last year. And we just filmed one 2 weeks ago that'll be out soon for the title track, One More
cool.
Drink. And I've got a couple more in the works. That's one of the things I was riffing to Charles' band about. And then I started a bunch of other bands with other musicians that could record at home. So I started this group called the Antivirals, which is like an OC hardcore band with members of the Cadillac Tramps. And I had also, right before COVID, started a band out of Long Beach with members of Social Distortion and the Cadillac Tramps and Final Conflict. And then when COVID hit, I started reaching out to other musicians that I knew. And like I met these guys, this band that I was already a big fan of called Warrior Soul, who are a New York band, but they're based out of Europe. I knew someone that was working with them. They were recording remotely. I was recording them remotely. Somehow I talked my way, as I do, into like, oh, let me play this, that. And now I'm working on their new record.
Oh,
and
that's cool.
It's just sort of been this ongoing thing throughout COVID of like, not only like to continue making music, but I'm like, fuck it, I'm going to triple down, quadruple down. I'm currently in 11 bands.
What?
Yeah. Cause I sing with James Williamson from the Stooges. I've done 2 albums with him. I play with the heavy metal guy Thor. So that's 2, plus the Cheetahs, plus Blindhouse, plus Antivirals, plus Warrior Soul, plus my solo stuff, plus there's a band called City Kids. There's a band I play in called Shameless. There's a band I play in that's an offshoot of City Kids called Anti-Fashion. And then lastly, there's Spaghetti and Frank, which is me and Eddie Spaghetti from the Super Suckers, another band we started over COVID. And all of them have put out singles, albums, videos over this last year because that's what I've been doing. And then all of them have made music videos, and I've been directing and editing all those, just been like a one-man sort of production machine here.
And you're not even a drummer.
No, I do. I mean, I do all the drum programming myself. And then usually what I do, if it's something that's going to come out, meaning, if I'm just at home making demos, I just do it all myself. But with a lot of the album stuff, I end up going into a studio with my drummer and having him play live drums on top, and I replace the fake drums with the live drums.
No, I'm just saying that's usually a drummer thing to be in 8 million bands, but you have that down. I mean,
well,
I'm actually impressed that you remember.
I write songs with them all too, and they all have different sounds. So that's been really the funnest part, is kind of just like, writing in all of these different directions. And so instead of just writing 20 songs now, I'll kind of be like, okay, I'm going to write a couple hardcore songs for this, a little pop stuff for this, some speed metal over here with Thor, some Stooges-y stuff with the guy from the Stooges. So you know what I mean? And by like a couple months go by and I look and I'm like, oh, I wrote 30 songs over the last 2 months, and they're all pretty
musical,
kind of musically all over the place,
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Well, that really proves my point. I think that sometimes limitations can honestly improve your creativity, because you kind of, like you said earlier in this interview, okay, I'm sort of looking to hone in on this particular thing. How am I going to do that with the skills I have?
Yeah, and actually the fun thing with making these music videos has been embracing the limitations, because I'm a good editor. I know how to edit, obviously. I use Adobe Premiere. I've been editing for years. But I'm not like a huge After Effects guy, and I'm not a huge Photoshop guy. Like, I always kind of end up either sort of winging it when I get to that stage. Or back when I was working at TV networks, we would have people that did that. So I just go, hey, you do the effects on the graph. Give me a graphics package, blah, blah, blah. You know, you do motion rotoscoping. You take care of that, whatever. But when I've been home doing it on my own and I hit a roadblock, there's really only two options. A, do I happen to know someone that has the time and owes me a favor and I could pull in a freebie and have someone just do this one shot for me, which I've done that. A couple shots in the We Are the Ones video. I had this kid, JJ Watt, and this guy JJ Watt I work with in Europe. He has a kid named Jasper Watt.
The Texans football player, JJ Watt?
No.
Okay.
No. His name is John Watt, but they call him JJ. He plays in the band City Kids, and his kid is a graphics guy, and so he did a few, like at the beginning of the We Are the Ones video when you see the joystick light up. Like he did a couple little shots like that. So I'll just call up people I know, pull in some favors. But a lot of times I just got to figure out something. And that's the limitations thing. Like, I want to do this. I don't know how to do that. Or I, would love to shoot it on a green screen. I don't know how to key in a green screen, and I don't have anyone to do it for me. So what else could I do? And then I think of something outside the box and something that's a reach around way to get there, a backdoor way. And I end up doing something else that works. And in the end, sometimes ends up a little cooler because it's not just a green screen. It's something weird I came up with that actually looks sort of funky and different,
Dang, that's inspirational as a perfectionist who has trouble starting anything.
Well, you can't be a perfectionist and think like that. You can't be Macgyver and a perfectionist at the same time. You gotta either be Jerry Garcia or Beethoven. They're both geniuses, but one's footloose and reckless and gets there with a few mistakes along the way, but oh, what a glorious, painting he's painted. And the other guy is a meticulous genius there's only one way to get there, and if he doesn't get there, ears are falling off, wrong composer, but you get the analogy.
Yeah, I love that.
But you know what I mean? It's both different paths. Neither one's wrong. I've always I like to improvise. I like to do one take if I can do it. I like to go, oh, I can't. Okay, instead of not finishing it, I'll think of something else and still get it done somehow. That's my philosophy is figure it out.
Yeah, and I never explicitly asked you what your music writing process is like, but I'm like, how the hell do I ask you that? You're in a bazillion different bands, and I'm sure it's a little different for everyone, maybe?
No, it's the same overall philosophy, I'm a product of my influences, so I get an idea, whether it's based on another idea, or a lot of times ideas are just a combination of other, you go out, wouldn't it be cool to do a movie that's I had a digital series I pitched at G4 once, and I said it's like Pee-wee's Playhouse meets Evil Dead. Oh, and that's exactly what it was. But meaning, and when I hear that, when I say that to you, you go, oh, so like a sort of a kid show, but like satanic with monsters, and I'm like, yeah, that's it. That was the show.
Cool.
Well, so when I write songs, a lot of times I get a melody in my head, and I just kind of go, okay, it sounds to me kind of like Cheap Trick, but with harder guitars, or maybe a double time punk thing too, or it sounds, it's just like you go, it's this meets this meets this, and then somehow by the time it filters out through my weird brain, it becomes something that sounds more like me. But all of my songs, I can tell you, like, okay, that's that meets that, and I stole that from there, and then that guitar riff is kind of based on this. That's art. Yeah. That's how you make art. It's just your product of your influences. You grab and pull and shape and pound that clay into something that's kind of different.
That's truly inspirational in a lot of ways, because again, it's like, man, you have to learn how to break out of that. Or maybe you just are that way. You just, hey, try it. You know what? Like, failure is how we learn. Failure is how we grow.
Well, you have to fail. Failing's the only way to ever know what you want, and also you only know what it's supposed to be like if you miss a few times. You have to kind of not get there in order to go, oh, that's how you get there. You got to get lost a few times before you sort of find your way home. So failing is not only not bad, it's like mandatory. If you don't fail, then you really can't, you're not prepared to win. And it also builds your character because you're hungrier if you've gotten knocked around a few times on your way there. Yeah. So you have to be able to fail. And then the other thing too is I just know so many artists that are completists to the point it's like they never stop editing themselves. And I certainly would be guilty of, like, there's a few of my projects where when I see them, I just see the mistakes and I go, oh, I wish I'd spend a little bit more time. On the other hand, I've done so many things that, like, if I spent, if each one of them I was just meticulous, I would never get anything done. Because at some point you just got to go, okay, it's as done as I can make it before I go insane on this project. Right. So I see everything through, and there's a point where I go, okay, it's done. Is it perfect? No, but okay, it's done. I'm a rock and roll guy. A lot of my favorite records have mistakes on them. So it's okay.
Easter eggs. It's more fun to listen to anyway. Well,
absolutely. We're talking about cheesy movies. I love movies when the boom mic drops in, or you can see like the back of the mask on the monster on the stuntman's head, or you know what I mean? Or the stunt doubles like a woman instead of a guy in the previous scene. Like, I love that shit.
You're right. It gives it character. I'll ask you a couple more things then. Like, now that you've put out the One More Drink album, and COVID is hopefully, God forbid, coming to an end in the next couple months if we can get enough vaccines here. But what's next for the Cheetahs? And is there anything else you want to bring up about the record that we didn't get to go over?
Yeah. Well, this is our first record. It's not our first recording in 20 years. We made songs over the years, and we appeared on a few compilations and stuff, but it's our first full album. And we've were writing songs over the last 5 years and sort of just took the best ones. And that was really the criteria. We weren't really concerned with how punk it was or how not punk it was. We just wanted to make sure that it connected with our sound, but mainly we just picked the best songs, the ones that we thought had the best hooks and were the most, kind of stick to your brain, sort of earworm type songs. And we're pretty happy with it. And we've got a couple guests that we really admire: John Easdale from Dramarama, Rick Agnew from the Adolescents, Paul Rossler from the Screamers and 45 Graves. So it was fun to get some of those folks involved. And they're more West Coast punk rock guys. Which, like I said, we've always sort of been more connected, even though we're an LA band, but we connected with the sound of the East Coast in Detroit. But on this record, we went a little bit more overtly West Coast, I suppose. So for right now, more videos. We got a video coming for One More Drink. We're going to do a summertime video for Ain't It Summer. And then I've got sort of a sci-fi video in mind for Let Me Out. And as soon as we can do live shows, we'll do live shows. It seems like it's opening up. I live in Long Beach, and here in Long Beach, I've been playing like acoustic shows, for instance. But it's like either me solo or like me and one other person, and it was all outdoors and patios up until about 3 weeks ago, and now it can be indoors. But you can't necessarily have like a full band up there sweating, and obviously you're only playing to like a third of the crowd. But it's hey, 6 months ago you couldn't do that, so. I'm hoping that within the next 6 months, we'll at least be able to, be doing some live outdoor shows or some webcast type things. And then hopefully within the year, we'll be actually full blown playing gigs. And until then, it's just going to be videos. And we've been doing like some acoustic radio performances and stuff like that, whatever we can do.
It's innovate or die right now, sadly.
Yeah, exactly. Innovate or die. It's exactly right. And then in the meantime, I think I know me and Eddie Spaghetti have our project Spaghetti and Frank, because we both have food references in our name. We have a record coming out this summer that is, I'm actually going to the studio with Eddie this weekend to finish that up. And that's sounding awesome. And then just more music. If you go, if you're on Instagram, I'm the Frank Meyer or Streetwalkin Cheetahs. If you're on Facebook, it's Frank M. Meyer or the Streetwalkin Cheetahs.
And I will link all those things at the end of this episode. Then,
and then of course, and I'll just one more little plug is on Bandcamp is the Streetwalkin Cheetahs or Frank Meyer. I also have a ton of solo stuff I've been releasing over this last year that kind of doesn't sound like the Cheetahs. It's sort of more like 80s synth rock, power poppy kind of stuff.
You definitely have piqued my interest knowing you're in all these projects, and I'm going to have a bunch of stuff to listen to. Then Frank, before I let you go, one, thank you so much for your breadth of knowledge. You know an insane amount of stuff about music and a whole world of music that I know very little about. So it's humbling and very fascinating.
I know tons of things that very little people care about.
That's that's my entire show. But
well, that's yeah. Then we'll get along famous.
No, it's been great, but I kind of have a it's not famous, but because I'm not famous, but it's my serial last question, and that would be if you could only listen to 3 albums for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Ooh, tough call. Okay, if we're going for the rest of my life, then I'm not going to worry about being cool. You know what I mean? Like if I had to list 10 records, then I could just like architect that in like the perfect 10 that just tells you everything you need to know about me. But if I got 3, I'm just going for desperation. What albums will I want to listen to for 10 more years if I'm stuck on this island? So Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street is probably my number 1. It's a long album. It's a double album, and they cover so much musical ground on it because it's got all the sort of Stonesy rockers, but it's got bluesy stuff and country stuff, and just covers a lot of ground. Boy, then I'm going to need something chill, so I'd probably go Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, because that's
classic.
Just a perfect record, and that's probably going to be a mood I'm going to need to, when I really am like sad and want to just like cry into my soccer ball.
Wilson.
Yeah, exactly. So I've got my rock and I've got my jazz. I think, boy, depending on what day you ask me this question, you probably get a different answer, but right now I'm going with Joe's Garage by Frank Zappa. Because again, it just has everything I love. It has the bluesy stuff. It has got weird avant-garde stuff. It has ripping guitar solos. There's a few different lead vocalists on it, so I feel like it would provide me with a nice a diverse audio experience, if you will.
Yes, I love hearing how people answer that question. So that's.
I wanted to say
great.
Stooges Funhouse. I wanted to say Heaven Tonight by Cheap Trick. Blah blah blah. Ramones, anything. But honestly, I'm going with those 3.
Good choice. Well, again, Frank, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate all the stuff I learned. I have a lot of listening to do. So. All right, hopefully you guys got as much out of that interview as I did. I definitely need to do a lot more research on punk bands. Frank schooled my ass, and he was such a pleasure to talk to. So if you're listening to the end of this, Frank, thanks again. I really enjoyed the chat. Make sure you follow him on Instagram. He is at the Frank Meyer. And then the Streetwalkin Cheetahs is just all one word, at Streetwalkin Cheetahs. And they are also on Facebook and all streaming platforms. So go ahead and go listen to their new album, One More Drink, and stay tuned for more puppet and video game themed music videos. As always, thank you for listening.